Hi, folks, and welcome to this session from 90 Days of DevOps. My name is Chris Kranz. I've been doing kind of clouds, DevOps, cloud technologies for a number of years now. I've done both public cloud services, I've done cloud security in a startup world for a number of years, but I've also done end user stuff. I've actually been a DevOps engineer, part of a DevOps team, building these projects, releasing these projects, going through the internal politics that are involved in some of these complex projects, especially when they come with that lovely brand of digital transformation. Even if they're exec sponsored, that's why I want to talk today about cross-functional empathy. So, first of all, what do I mean by cross-functional empathy? Well, let's break it down. Empathy, this is understanding kind of where someone else is coming from, why someone thinks a certain way, why someone approaches a problem or a challenge in a certain way. And then the cross-functional side of things is clearly what we're talking about with DevOps. DevOps is the intersection, as we all know, of developers and infrastructure and operations, and also networking and security and storage and all these other different teams. You're not looking for that singular full stack DevOps engineer, although you go through 90 Days DevOps, you're going to have a fairly good flavor across that broad spectrum. But generally, your DevOps team is a mix of people who are what we might call those T-shaped individuals. So a nice long cross-section and then a depth of knowledge in a certain area. That depth of knowledge might be security or storage or automated builds, or it could be a developer. You end up with this DevOps team, which is cross for all of those. So I want to start things off with a story from when I was working with end user environments. I was working for a .com effectively. I was in the architecture team. We had infrastructure architects, we had application architects, database architects, security architects, and I'll be honest with you, we actually spent very little time with the developers. We sat in our own team. It was a great little team and we had lots of fun. But we weren't 100% integrated with the rest of the developers and the infrastructure teams. Don't get me wrong, we spent a fair bit of time with them, but we weren't building, we weren't implementing, we weren't operating. We were designing, and occasionally we'd get calls and we'd be kind of like, oh yeah, this is how you might do this, or you've got a problem with that. Okay, maybe we can adapt the architecture a little bit. But for the most part, we were designing stuff and then passing it off to the actual engineers, whether that was infrastructure engineers, cloud engineers, developers, etc., etc. And the problem is that didn't always work. We would come up with these usually very, very good and very, very sound designs, but they were to the letter in terms of best practice guides and stuff, which meant in practical terms, sometimes they were very difficult to implement. Sometimes they were very long-winded to implement. So because we hadn't spent that time with the engineering team, we weren't designing stuff that was relevant to their world. As my time on there progressed, we did end up spending more time with them. There were regular stand-ups, there were regular sprint demos and stuff, which we were attending, and we tried to be part of as much as we could with those different operations. So it drastically improved over the time that was there. We all noticed this was an issue. So as a whole team, we started spending more time with those individual doers, whether it's engineers, support folks, developers, etc., etc. And that really changed our point of view of how we were designing stuff. You end up with what we love to talk about, things like MVP, minimum viable product, MMF, minimum marketable function, and all those other acronyms. And it ended up increasing the relationship we had with those engineers, those doers, but it also ended up improving the actual designs we were producing. So let's dig into a little bit more detail around empathy and what we mean in relation to specifically to DevOps and the cross-functional element that I'm talking about here. So empathy, like I said earlier, is the ability to understand someone else's viewpoint, to understand their feelings and why and how they approach things in a certain way. So let's take, for example, security. You might be in a world where you have to relate with security from afar. So you're building something, you're designing something, you're building infrastructure, an application, whatever it is, and then you have to make a request to security. It goes to a faceless portal. I need these things, goes up to security, and security come back and say no. Okay, why are they saying no? Sometimes we have this impression that security is a blocker. This happens with a lot of these different, I don't want to say silos, because they're not always silos, it's just these different specialisms. Traditionally, they can be siloed, but they don't necessarily have to be. Sometimes it's storage, sometimes it's the infrastructure team requesting more compute, whatever it may be. So let's have a think about why might security say no to something? And from a security's point of view, the security team is looking at things from a risk perspective. What things am I doing that's exposing us to risk? Or what things are going to make my job more difficult? Are we releasing something with lots of vulnerabilities? Are we releasing a payment portal without TLS encryption? Things like that. So when you're making those requests, you need to have a think about what is security's interest in this. Now, it's difficult to say, okay, think like a security person. If you've never spent time with a security person, that's a really difficult thing to do. Likewise, from a storage perspective, I'm saying, right, my application is going to require 5 terabytes of storage, so I'm going to request that. And the storage team are constantly juggling this. I need to provide enough storage for the entire business, not just you, the entire business, in an efficient way where I don't have lots of storage sitting around doing nothing. Now, I know that I can give you these examples because I've been a storage engineer. I've done security. There are parts of the industry that I absolutely haven't done. I mean, to me, setting up a VPN, pretty straightforward. You've got 2 VPN endpoints, you get to talk to each other, job done. I don't know the nuances and the details of that, but I've worked on projects where my colleagues have. I've spent time sitting down with them, hearing some of their challenges, hearing some of the things that they're struggling with. So you end up building this empathy. Let me tell you about another story. So when I was working for a different organization, we were working as a DevOps team and we were building everything with open source products. But I knew that there were certain areas of our stack which at some point might need a commercial solution. So as someone who's worked as a vendor, as a reseller for many, many years, I knew that procurement isn't just let's get them involved at the last minute and let's hope that all goes well. I knew that procurement and legal could be a long-winded process. And I also knew that I knew nothing about that company, my employer's processes. So I reached out to the procurement team. They came down and said, let's properly talk about this and work out what you actually need. And that's there having that empathy, is actually sitting down with the procurement team and working out what do I need to do to make your life easier? Because then it becomes enjoyable working with those people. They like working with you, you like working with them, to make sure that you understand their processes and why they exist. There's some processes that I don't understand. I've signed contracts digitally and then you print them off and then put a wet signature and put it in the post. And I don't understand that process. There will be legal reasons, but I don't understand them. Every organization has different structures, has different processes, has different people and personalities. People come from having different experiences. One legal person I worked with, they'd had experience working at a reseller. So they had very different experiences of how contracts go together and how you negotiate those contracts and such. I've worked with other legal teams who have only ever worked for end users, and they were stubborn, I guess you could say, but they just had a very end user perspective. They were very much looking after the company, and they themselves didn't have empathy for the vendor or the reseller or the partner who would try to sell in a solution. All of these needs to be partnerships. Otherwise, you just end up with a very fractious relationship and a very tense relationship, which none of us want. I mean, DevOps is hard enough as it is without having these challenges of relationships. And now, I also want to touch on global teams. Now, I know not everyone works with global teams. I have got a fair bit of experience. I've worked for Americans a number of times. They have a very specific work ethic and a way of doing business, which in many respects is very different to the way we do things in mainland Europe. There's different cultural work ethics and kind of societal norms. Ignoring things like how many days paid vacation you've got and how many national public holidays there are. Aside from that, there's just different cultural societal norms. If you speak to Americans, they're quick to joke about how Europeans take vacations. You speak to Europeans and they're like, well, why don't Americans take vacations? What a ridiculous thing. And you have these polar different views. But it's really important to understand that and understand the way different people react in certain situations. You may be used to a very British or a very American way of doing things, but then you have differences across Europe. It's important to understand when I'm talking to someone from a Nordic country, how that might come across different and how their reaction might be different than if I'm speaking to someone from France, Italy, or Spain, and how that might be different from someone from Germany, for example. And it's just differences. When you're presenting to a room or you're working with a whole room full of people, you will get different reactions from people. The other side of that is working out that internal translation process. If you are a native English speaker and you're listening to me without this being translated, without subtitles, you are natively thinking in the language I'm speaking. So you are understanding it immediately and you're processing that immediately. Now, if I'm speaking to someone who is English as a second language and you don't necessarily think it English, then you may need to think about what I'm saying, process it, occasionally translate it, depending on your fluency. And then if I challenge you with something that makes you think, you may need to fully translate the entire concept into your native language so you can process it more easily. And I've seen this presenting across European and across Asian countries. You present to them and they fully understand you. And I'm not good with multi-language. I'm amazed that people can speak so fluently in English. So this is not knocking anyone's skills or ability in speaking different languages, because it is amazing. But there is that core processing engine that's in your head. And you need to leave that space. You have this inclusivity. We talk about DEI all the time, but this inclusivity and this equity side of things is when you talk about something, if you've got a multicultural team and a multicultural room, make sure that there's time for people to process that into their own language. If you ask a complex question, they're going to have to think about that. Don't ask a complex question. Go to the room. Any questions? A couple of English natives speak up and say, yep, and then move on. Give them 5 or 10 seconds to process that and think that through. Better yet, if you've got a really critical question, critical problem, do it before a break. So give them the opportunity to digest that. It's actually useful for everyone, even if you're a native English speaker. You've got that process of thinking about a problem. I do a lot of sales coaching and sales training and have done over the years. And it's something that I try and coach salespeople on. If you're going to ask a difficult question, you need to leave that moment of silence for people to process that. And that moment of silence will depend on the cultural, on the different language skills you've got in the room. But it also depends on the complexity of the question you've just asked. So if you've got maybe a complex challenge in your DevOps project, in your cloud transformation project, whatever it may be, you need to make sure there's that dwell time, that ability to sit there and think about that and process it. One of my recommendations, send your questions ahead of time. If you've got a meeting and you really want to get specific goals out of that meeting, send those questions ahead of time. It gives people the ability to sit down, think about that. Even the fully native speakers, they're going to need that time to sit there and process that question. But also, even more so for the non-native, so for the second language speakers, is they need time to process that and to translate that so you can get the best results. The great thing about that, and in terms of the diversity of thoughts there, is you're going to get a varied set of responses. Spreading this out and getting a diverse team is really important from that perspective. So that was a lot about kind of cultural diversity, and not everyone has those challenges, not everyone has those opportunities. So in a non-culturally diverse or non-global team, so you're working in London and all of your team is in London. In that scenario, I'm assuming you're still working in a DevOps team or looking to work in a DevOps team. How can you grow the cross-functional capability of your team and you yourself build the empathy? My number one recommendation is to spend time with people. It could be 30 minutes. Drop an email to someone in procurement, say, hey, I want to understand better about the procurement processes we go through when we're acquiring new software, new hardware. Go and sit down with procurement and spend a bit of time with them. Go spend lunch with them. Just spend some time with them. I think that is my number one recommendation. And if I was to give you a challenge, I would say have a look at your calendar. Have a look at someone who you want to spend a bit of time. You want to understand them better. Maybe it's procurement, maybe it's legal, maybe it's someone's security team, maybe it's someone's storage team, network team. Maybe you're not in DevOps yet and you want to understand more about it. Go look for a DevOps lead, DevOps engineer, someone who's made that change recently. Find some time in their calendar and book a meeting with them. Go stop the video right now. I will wait. I'll be here, don't worry. Start the video right now and go make an appointment just with one person. Hopefully you went and did that. I would say it is one of the best ways to grow that empathy, to grow that understanding of what is it that other people are doing? Why am I getting this resistant? Why do people talk to me in a certain way? Sometimes it's just terminology. I'm talking to the storage team and they're talking about LUNs and iSCSI and over-provisioning, under-provisioning, IOPS and all this stuff. I don't understand what they're talking about or even what they're asking for. Go spend a bit of time with them. Go pick their brains. The one thing about the human condition is generally people love to talk about things that they're passionate about and they know about. They'd probably love the opportunity to sit down and actually talk to you about what it is that they do, What's the number one reason they reject requests? What is the number one issue they have to work on and troubleshoot? And then you can have some pride as you're building your projects, your applications, whatever you're doing. Think about, what is it that I can do so that my application doesn't increase their stats for that particular thing? Maybe that's just one target. But you do that enough and you end up just building these relationships with these different teams, and you end up having a reputation. That's the person that doesn't contribute to my red board of tickets. Great. They're going to be much more amiable when you come to them with requests and come to them. So it is important. Even people that you don't necessarily have those interactions with, or maybe you don't have those requirements to do that with, it's important to do. I've spent time with, for example, HR teams and recruitment teams. The reason for it, at some point, I'm going to need to be a hiring manager. Even if you're not, you could be an interviewer, you could be on an interview panel. So understanding the HR process and what HR people go through, getting this understanding of how different parts of the business work. Now, there's another side of this, kind of a bigger picture stuff here, is that understanding more of the business is really useful for you as your career grows. You might have aspirations of one day becoming an exec or being a senior person in the business, in which case you're going to need to have a much better understanding of how these different functions work. So spending time with those people is going to progress you in your growth as a DevOps person short term, but is also going to be great in your long-term career progression, whatever your goals may be in the future. Sometimes we talk about that DevOps is a cultural thing, which it very much is. And sometimes people talk about it's a leadership thing. The leadership need to sponsor it and need to push it down, and it is all on leadership. Now, yes, leadership do need to sponsor it. Yes, it needs to be driven from the top, but it also needs to be driven from the bottom. So regardless of where you are, you can help improve the DevOps culture, adoption of DevOps, both in yourself and within your team. There's nothing more frustrating. You could be the best DevOps engineer in the world, but if you're working in an organization that culturally is not embracing DevOps, you're going to struggle in your own personal development because the rest of the team or the culture is holding you back. So it is important for you, wherever you are in that stack, wherever you are in seniority, to uphold some of these principles. So the empathy is great to understand where people come from, but that's kind of useless if you don't give people a voice. So make sure that all the key stakeholders are heard. And if people aren't saying, yeah, that's great, or no, that's a problem, quiz them on it, because they could still be in that processing phase you talked about earlier. They could still be working out, okay, what's the challenge here? And there's a number of times I've held meetings and everyone seems to be okay. And then a day later, you get an email from someone saying, I've been thinking about this and actually I can see some challenges, or actually I can see some areas for improvement. It's really important to make sure that everyone's voice is welcome. You don't have to be owning that meeting. You don't have to be the project manager to be the leader there. If you see someone, and sometimes you can see this in body language, sometimes you can see this in processing, sometimes you just see it because someone is talked over. I'm sure you've all been in meetings where 3 or 4 people talk at once. This happens especially over Zoom meetings. But 3 or 4 people talk at once, but not everyone actually finishes what they were going to say. One person ends up being the winner, and other people are like, okay, I'm going to keep my point to myself for now. Take a point of actually going back to them and say, hey, Chris, what was your point? Or you could email them in the background, depending on how shy they are or what they're doing. They may just turn around and say, actually, no, that person made my point. I agree with them 100%. That may be why they didn't repeat it. But it's important to identify and highlight that everyone has a voice in the room and make sure that everyone's got equal equity in the way they talk. There are some psychological nuances of this as well. And if you are a leader or if you're close to a leader, feel free to coach them on this, is the senior person in the room, don't get them to speak first. The reason for that is that generally people follow leaders, people follow seniority. If a senior person in the room says something, even if it's fundamentally wrong, a lot of people will be like, yeah, that sounds about right. I'm not going to challenge the status quo. I'm going to go with that. That's fine. Let's agree with that. So encourage the people who are less senior to speak first. Now that can be challenging and it can be quite intimidating as well. But you will find, not every single time, but you will find that sometimes you'll get much more interesting thoughts and thought processes, and you'll have some unique insights sometimes because they don't have these preconceived ideas. which is where the empathy comes in, because understanding where people come from. Why does a senior person think of a certain way? Well, they worked at Amazon or they worked at a FANG organization, so they've got a certain way of thinking about projects. Whereas this person, fresh out of college, fresh out of university, they've just studied these things. They have that certain way of thinking because they're just completely innocent, naive, so they don't have any preconceived ideas, which can be great. Make sure that no idea is ever shot down. No idea is a bad idea. Embrace that and just talk that through and think that through. If someone comes up with something, an idea that is something that you know is fundamentally wrong, it's like, it's an interesting idea, but we're not going to do it. Here's why we're not going to do it. And explain that, because then you're helping someone else understand your point of view. Empathy in general is something that we don't have enough of across the entire industry and across the entire world. Everything we're doing culturally, politically, all the rest of it. Empathy is something that is a really important skill to develop, and no one doesn't have it. You can talk psychopaths and stuff all day long, but no one doesn't have the capability to have it. But it's a muscle, effectively. You need to practice that. You need to develop it. Another challenge for you, again, stop the video in a second and go and do this. One of the things I love doing in my last job, and there's a variety of benefits to doing it, but go through your company directory. Find someone who you don't know that works in a business unit that is of interest for whatever reason. It could be just, okay, they're working on this project. It could be they're in a part of the business that I don't understand at all. Try and do a little bit of research on that person. Doesn't need to be long. If they're an engineer, go look at their commits. See what code they've been producing. If they're a documentation person, see what documentation they've been doing recently. If they work in HR, see what team they work under. You could reach out to that person's manager and just say, hey, trying to get to know this person a little bit better. Can you tell me about what piece of work they've done wrong recently? Once you've done that research, reach out to them. Just drop them an email, drop them a note, drop them a Slack message and say, hey, I saw you were working on this, really loved it. I hope you're doing well. Give them a completely unexpected compliment. And it does wonders. Number one, you will make that person's day. I've got a whole bunch of clips. I keep them. I've got all these scrapbooks of messages from responses from people when I've reached out to people, and it is incredibly uplifting. But the other thing there is it helps you understand what people are working with, what people are going through, how people are doing. The number of times I'd reached out to someone and say, hey, love that piece of code you just wrote, love what you do in our recruitment team, thank you for bringing on this new person, whatever it was. And they come back and say, thanks, I've had a really terrible week, or I've been having a hard time with this. This was a really powerful message for me. It is a hugely valuable thing to do. And it doesn't matter who you are. Now, if you're more senior, then that message comes with a little bit more weight. I won't disagree with that. If you're a CEO and you write to a random person in the business to say, you're doing an awesome job, it can make your whole week. Whoever you are, though, you can really lift someone up by doing that. And like I say, it really improves that empathy side of things because you spend that time understanding what someone else is working with, what someone else is working on, what challenges they went through maybe. And it's a great way to start a conversation. Maybe this is the conversation. Thank you very much for releasing this piece of code. I've been using it with my customers. Their response might be, oh, thank you. I was really worried about that. We spent ages on that. We had some challenges with it. And then you might come back and you start a whole conversation. Well, what were the challenges you had with it? It seems to just make perfect sense that that's how we do it. Great job. And they're like, wow, it took us a long time. Whatever that conversation might be. But it is a great conversation starter. So if you're not sure how to reach out to these people, start with a compliment. But ignoring that, it's just a nice thing to do. We don't take those opportunities often enough to be awfully nice to each other. So make time to do that. Like I say, it's a great opportunity to grow your understanding of what other people in the business are doing, which is going to help exercise that empathy muscle. So what I wanted to do is give you some understanding of what cross-functional empathy is and things that you can do, regardless of what you are, regardless of what role you have, regardless of your seniority, regardless of your job goals, regardless of your career goals and aspirations, regardless of what you've already done. You can always take time to build your empathy, to exercise your empathy muscle, and to build new relationships. And honestly, my last job, the one thing I loved about that place was just so many awesome people there. And I reached out to lots of people who I had no business working with or talking to, but it was fantastic doing so. You get to talk to all sorts of people, and I ended up with some fantastic friends who I wish I had the time to spend more time with now. I think that's one of the biggest improvements that can improve the DevOps culture, that cross-functional team, building those cross-functional cultures different people from different backgrounds, different influences, different demands on their jobs, on the technology they're working on, or just the team they're working on. Everyone comes from a different place, and you can't always see that if you just look at it from outside in. Spending time with these people is absolutely the best way to help improve that. Please do take some of my feeds from actually reaching out to people, spend a bit of time. You know what? It could just be say, right, I'm going to earmark 30 minutes a month. Ideally, 30 minutes a week, I think would be perfect. But 30 minutes a month, maybe it's just no more than that. I'm going to reach out to one person in the organization. Maybe they are related to the project I'm working on. Maybe I'm just going to start building a relationship with the security team or the storage team or the network team, whatever it is. And I'm going to spend 30 minutes a month. I'm going to sit down with that person. I'm going to go to lunch with them. Or I'm going to just spend 30 minutes on a call. Some people really like it just to break up the monotony. Don't have that imposter syndrome of, oh my gosh, this person is not going to want to spend time with me. They are too busy. You'd be surprised how many people do it, how many people appreciate it. What's the worst can happen? Someone could say, no, sorry, I've not got time this week. Maybe they'll book it in 3, 4, 5 weeks' time. Worst case, someone says, no, I've not got time for you at all. And that's fine. Don't take that as a negativity. People are busy. But people do want to reach out. They do want to hear from you. The other key takeaway I've got is go and look someone up in your organization, do a bit of research on them, and just give them a compliment. There's nothing in it for you. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to want or require anything back. There's a whole bunch of messages I sent out in my last gig and no one replied. And that's fine. But you know what? Just spend a bit of time doing it. It takes you 10, 15 minutes. Look for people, look someone up, see what they do, give them a compliment. Simple as that. You'll be surprised how it builds relationships and helps you on your journey of understanding how the DevOps culture works, where people come from, and just making you a much stronger member of the team. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was useful. I wanted to give you some actual actions, a couple of stories. So I hope this was useful. Feel free to reach out to me on, probably LinkedIn is probably the best place these days, but feel free to reach out to me if you've got any questions or a random compliment. I appreciate them too. Thank you very much. Good luck in your DevOps journey. Take care.